I just am so delighted to have you here at Pasadena Presbyterian Church. I'm Lisa Hanson, the senior pastor here at this church, and on behalf of the members of Pasadena Presbyterian Church, we want to welcome you into our space. We want this to be a space where you feel at home and a space where you feel comfortable. We're very excited to be working with the library tonight and being able to host this wonderful event, and we hope that you are uplifted and encouraged by everything that you experience tonight. I have the honor of introducing to you the acting director of the library, Tim McDonald.
Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight as we celebrate our 21st annual One City, One Story author event for the community. Isn't that wonderful? We're supported tonight by our founding sponsor for One City, One Story, the Friends of the Pasadena Public Library. Thank you, friends. And also our community sponsor, the Pasadena Literary Alliance, Pasadena Festival of Women Authors. Thank you for your support. I'm Tim McDonald, the acting library director for the Pasadena Public Library, and I am overjoyed that we can be here together in person to resume One City, One Story. It's going to be a terrific night. Have you read the book? Anybody read it? Yeah. Did you enjoy it?
Yes.
Yeah, I did too. We're going to have a fantastic presentation by this year's author, Nadia Hashimi, and a question and answer period afterwards. If you haven't already, there's an opportunity to jot down your questions, and then the library staff will collect them, and we'll ask as many of them as we can before we get Nadia back on the plane to the East Coast tonight. So we do have a hard cutoff tonight. I'm going to do a little bit of housekeeping and a lot of thank yous, because an event like this does not happen without a lot of support from the community and different partners that we enjoy. It starts with a selection committee that chooses the book and the author that we're enjoying tonight. And I've got a list. I don't want to make sure I didn't leave anybody out, so forgive me while I read the names. This year's One City, One Story selection committee was made up of, and maybe we can give them a round of applause at the end, if that sounds good. Sharon Calkin, Rosemary Choate, Carrie Custer, Brooke Larson-Garlock, Jill Hunting, Sally Kauser, Susanna Porras, Christine Reeder, Maggie Reyes-Rothner, Deborah K. Sanchez, Mary Schuler, and Arnie Siegel. Big round of applause for our selection committee. Thanks. That's awesome. The Pasadena Public Library has a wonderful advisory group, the Library Commission, that meets throughout the whole year and gives advice on the needs of the community and how the library can best serve them. And many of those commissioners are here tonight, and I want to say a special thank you for their support throughout the entire year. The Library Commission Chair, Mike Stammer, is here tonight, as well as the other members, Adrian Bass, Judy Blanton, Chelsea Dickerson, Robert Karatsu, Bo Patadian, and Leslie Rosenthal. Thank you, commissioners. Thank you, commissioners. Awesome. Of course, we'd like to thank our host tonight, the Pasadena Presbyterian Church, the staff, and the members, congregation, for welcoming us to this beautiful facility. While Central Library is temporarily closed, it's kind of been an opportunity for us to reach out and find new venues and make new partners and reach new parts of the community we haven't before. And boy, did we hit a gold mine tonight. What a beautiful setting for tonight's talk. So it's wonderful to be here tonight. Thank you. So, speaking of Central Library, the question I'm asked the most is, what's happening with Central Library when we get back in? So I'll briefly give you the good news. A month ago, City Council unanimously approved a contract to a design team, Gruen Associates, and their 10 outstanding subcontractors who have worked on multiple projects together over the years on historic buildings and libraries. So we know we need to preserve that beautiful building, but we're also going to take this opportunity to add some enhancements to bring the building into the 21st century. We're always hearing things like, the restrooms are too small, or we need more places to charge our phones. So we're going to make sure that we preserve that beautiful, majestic look of the library while also taking, like I said, the opportunity to bring it into the 21st century. What you can expect next is announcements of community meetings where we can listen to you, tell us what we can do better at Central Library. So expect some announcements soon for community meetings to share that input. This Gruen Associates group that I mentioned is fantastic. If you're interested in seeing any of the projects that they've worked on, there are many locally here that you can get to quite easily. If you've been to the Central Library in Glendale, they've worked on that renovation. The beautiful Brand Music Library, which is over 100 years old and is now home of a performing arts center and library, is one of their projects. And one that I feel is really special too is in downtown Los Angeles, the Tower Theater was recently renovated. Now, believe it or not, has an Apple store inside of it. It's jaw-dropping. It's really beautiful, and it really shows the care that they took with this type of renovation work. If you make it down there, be sure to take an extra minute and go down to the lower level where they have a small museum of before and after, what they did and the care that they took with all the furnishings in the building and the projects that they did. So we can expect that level of passion of what they'll do for the design work at Central Library. The design phase is not going to cost the city anything. We were lucky, we got a $9 million grant from the California State Library for this design phase of the project, which will not be a short phase. It's going to take us 2 years just to come up with a design. But hang tight, we'll get through it together, and please stay tuned because you're the library lovers that we need to listen to hear how to do Central Library rights. Please stay tuned for that. We're really excited to join this next phase. Thanks for letting me take that segue, but I knew people would want to know what the latest is there. I get back to my notes so I don't leave anybody out. We have some more partners to thank. A couple of other people that made tonight possible in our community were Blair High School, Vroman's Bookstore, who is supplying the books that you're able to purchase tonight, and has a beautiful display for tonight's program too. The Walden School was a partner this year. We had some fantastic presenters at the library this month that gave programs related to the themes of the book, and I'd like to thank Mitra Alakoze, who's the executive director of Sahar, Education for Afghan Girls nonprofit. It was a wonderful program. Christine, is that program recorded, do you know? Go to the library's website and look for a link to that, or Christine can show you how to access that. There's a wonderful on program you can see a recording of. And also to Sonali Kolhatkar, the co-founder and co-director of the Afghan Women's Mission, gave a wonderful talk this month too. And all of our book clubs have been reading, and I want to thank those members for being here tonight and reading the book too. I'd like to thank the Pasadena Public Library staff, who were really fantastic. Quarterbacked by Christine Reeder, who did a wonderful job every year doing this. 4 months ago in November on Election Day, the community gave ringing endorsement for programs like this when voters in Pasadena approved Measure L. 84.6% of the voters said yes. To Measure L, which is great, fantastic. Said, we're going to guarantee funding for the library operations for the next 15 years because we value programs like this that bring people together, readers that can come together and discuss a book like this, which we're going to enjoy tonight. I can't wait to introduce the author. I think Mayor Gordo is running late. Is that correct? Is he here? Oh, thank you. Okay. Believe it or not, with the lights shining in my eyes, I didn't see you. Thanks. So I have the pleasure of introducing our esteemed Mayor Victor Gordo, will introduce the author. Thank you. Great to see you. My apologies.
He was doing so well. Yeah. No, this is better. And he was doing so well. But let's give him a round of applause for, I'll tell you, one of the things that I'm most proud of in Pasadena is how special we are because of the people in Pasadena. And when I say the people of Pasadena, I mean residents, staff, past and present. I mean all of us who enjoy this terrific city and who step up when the time comes. And so I want to personally thank you for having done that. A job well done. Continued. So, you know, I think about Pasadena and what a special place it is. And this is the 21st anniversary of One City, One Story. And I can't believe I've been here for every single one of those years as a member of the city council. But give yourselves a round of applause for starting, engaging in, and supporting a terrific, terrific program that's brought us so many terrific books, so many terrific authors, and really enriched Pasadena in so many different ways. It's just, you know, we often think about Pasadena as a place, a geographic place, but it's not. It's a community. Sure, our buildings are beautiful, you know, and this is one of them. Boy, what a beautiful building this is. And, you know, we often think about the civic buildings, but when you think about some of the privately owned businesses, including some of the churches, they're beautiful, beautiful buildings. And so, again, they enrich our culture and enrich our lives here as Pasadena. But that's not why we're here. We're here to talk about a terrific author, Nadia Hashimi, who has done a terrific job in laying out a novel about displacement, about her experience in the world that weaves in not just a beautiful story that's enriches our life, but also brings it from a point of view, her point of view, and her life's own experience. A former pediatrician, or are you still a pediatrician? A pediatrician who also is talented as a writer. And I just can't imagine how many more talents you might have to be a doctor, a writer, and someone who cares deeply about her cultural roots, who writes beautifully about an issue we all care about and is so timely, the issue of displacement in the world. And it reminds us how fortunate we are to have a community in Pasadena, to have a state to live in and a country to live in where we can all feel welcome. And so I want to thank you for, one, your work and your dedication to sending a message so beautifully, and for doing so right here in Pasadena. And on behalf of all residents of Pasadena, and on behalf of our library community, I say thank you and welcome you to our beautiful city.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege.
Now, you all know that there's only one thing that the mayor of Pasadena can give, and that's the official City of Pasadena mayor's pin. Now, it's not a huge gift, but it means a lot to me as mayor of Pasadena, and only the mayor of Pasadena can give it away. And I believe it means a lot to the people of Pasadena, because the mayor's office is the people's office here in Pasadena. And so I will present to you the official City of Pasadena mayor's pin to commemorate your visit to Pasadena.
Oh my gosh, thank you so much. Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you for that kind welcome. So thank you all for being here tonight. This has just been a really incredibly gracious welcoming, and I'm so appreciative of the hospitality to the many groups and the many individuals who have made tonight possible, to the library teams and teams. I mean, I've met so many people from the library family, and the enthusiasm for books and for storytelling is incredible. To the Pasadena Literary Women's Festival. I had the privilege of being here last year, and so I'm especially delighted to be able to come back and truly honored. And this is just such a gorgeous space. I mean, I was thinking it's a shame that my children aren't here to see me speaking. They might be a little bit less irreverent with me at home. So it means a lot to be here because a lot has happened in the last couple of years. Well, a lot has happened around Afghanistan in the past few decades, but in the last couple of years, we've had another wave of really tragic stories, of really important events. And so in the context of all of that happening, it means a lot that Pasadena has made a home for this story in your homes, in your libraries, and in your shared spaces. So thank you for that. For those of you who haven't read the book, and if you haven't, it's okay. No spoilers tonight. But if you haven't read the book, it is the story of a young girl who is a survivor of and a witness to a 1978 military coup that happens in Kabul, Afghanistan. She happens to be in the palace on this evening because of her father's important position. And as a survivor of that coup, she carries a lot of trauma, she carries a lot of grief with her as she resurrects her life in the United States in the care of a woman who was a Foreign Service officer stationed in Afghanistan. So I wrote Sparks Like Stars for a couple of reasons. One was to really talk about the way Afghanistan's narrative was played out when I was growing up. If we could switch slides, please. So when I was growing up in the New York and New Jersey area, in the 80s, there was not a lot about Afghanistan that was out there in the news or in the media. And so whatever did come out, we kind of latched onto with a hunger for being able to see our own stories, to be able to see ourselves. And so I distinctly remember what we did have. And one was a MacGyver episode, and he was like honestly my favorite character on TV. I watched every episode anyway, and then this episode was like, MacGyver went to Afghanistan, now he's a real hero. And he did whatever he usually does with, I don't know, duct tape and bubble gum, and made an explosive and did really incredible things. And then there was Rambo 3, where he came into the country in his unique military uniform of a tank top and a matching black bandana and a lot of baby oil. And that literally was the image that we would see. It was sort of, front and center, there's Rambo, and then in the background, there's sort of like a bunch of Afghans who have some weapons on their shoulders. And we had this on a VHS tape that we would, take out every once in a while and then rewatch that movie. And then, next slide, please. And then, of course, there were the images of the Soviet troops rolling into Afghanistan, because that was also the story of the country, was that it had been invaded by the Russians, and that was what led to then decades of conflict and the civil war that went after that. Next slide, please. And the one source of pride that Afghans really had was this idea, this identity that Afghanistan was the graveyard of empires, that nations had come in, but no one had been able to conquer this country because the people were so defiant and so resistant, which just means stubborn, really, as evidenced by my family. And then there were the stories of Afghan women. Next slide, please. So truly, the stories of Afghan women were told in literally, I think, 2 pictures that I can remember. And in the age of Google and being able to find these images, it was really clear. So the top image is one of the visuals, and that was of a woman just completely clad in a burqa, where you couldn't see a face, you couldn't see anything, there was no identity, there was no personality. And the women were sort of meek and cowering under the whip of a brutal person like the Taliban over them. And then the other image was, of course, the National Geographic picture, the cover of the magazine with the girl, the refugee girl who had those haunting green eyes. I remember being in New York City one year for the Halloween parade, which is fascinating. You should take part if you ever can. And I remember seeing someone actually wearing a red headscarf and carrying a yellow cardboard frame, walking around as that Afghan girl. And so these are the stories. I actually did a Google search a couple days before coming here. And so to go from that time to now, in Google search, I typed in Afghan woman, and these were the images that came up. So that's my little screenshot, which is a shame because this is such a limited view and such a incomplete story of Afghan women. But what we hear from this is always that, oh, Afghan women are so resilient and they're so strong. And I do believe that, but it is also a bit problematic, and we'll get to that. So the reason that I wanted to explore a different time period in Sparks Like Stars, next slide please, is because I grew up with very, very different images and ideas and experiences that I inherited from my parents, from my extended family members, and then also even from my husband and his family. And these images of Afghanistan really don't jive with the images that I just showed you. Afghanistan is also a country that is extremely rich in poetry, that is extremely romantic. My great-grandfather was a poet, and the language and the lyrics of the songs, of our music, have a lot of double entendres, can be actually quite racy. This is the Afghan Elvis. Ahmed Zahir is one of our singers. This music has been played in every household, and that's one way that we really connect with each other. I know that I can walk into any Afghan household and I will hear the same songs because this is the soundtrack of our lives. We're also a really colorful culture. Our traditional dresses have tiny mirrors on them that catch the light and have a lot of embroidery, and our jewelry is big and bold. My mom would tell stories about playing basketball in her college team as she was studying engineering. My dad would talk about saving up money to go to the movies with his friends. Next slide, please. My own uncles enjoyed music. They enjoyed kind of all the same activities that you would think anybody else would talk about growing up in any country that was peaceful. People had the luxury of dying of natural causes. Next slide, please. These images that you're seeing are ones of that time period, the late 60s into the 70s of Afghanistan, where there were fashion shows and people traveling into the nation from other places. And that top picture over here, the gentleman who has a really big head of hair and a bold mustache is my uncle. And he has a lot less hair now. He's okay with me saying that, but still very passionate about the music. So I wanted to capture this moment because I thought it was precious. And because it was so unheard of, it also felt like maybe in this story I could share some family secrets too. When I was growing up, people really did not have any context for Afghanistan. I do remember somebody asking me which continent it was on, and if it was in Africa or Europe. When people would ask me where I was from, the reactions were usually like a polite nod and smile. But there was one time that I was at a friend's house for a study date. We were studying math, and my friend's Dutch father walked into the room and asked me, as people usually do, "Where are you from?" When I told him, he actually reacted very strongly, and he said, "Really? Afghanistan?" And I said, "Yes." And he thought, "Oh gosh, you guys have the best weed." So, I didn't actually go home and tell my parents about that because I worried that I might not ever go to Eva's house again and study. I did tell them about it recently, and they kind of laughed it off. But that's what people were doing. People were wandering into the country and kind of, enjoying the dispensaries. There was a time that I'd stopped at a coffee truck and got a cup of coffee, and the gentleman asked me where I was from. And when I told him, he said, "You don't look like an Afghan woman." And I asked him, "What does an Afghan woman look like?" To which he didn't really have an answer, because he realized, and I realized, that there's a real hole where an image of an Afghan woman should be. So in trying to come up with the ideas of how I wrote this story and why, I came across a quote from Alice Munro that I thought really encapsulated the origins of a story, not just this collection of anecdotes. But she wrote, "Anecdotes don't make good stories. Generally, I dig down underneath them so far that the story that finally comes out is not what people thought their anecdotes were about." So in a population like Afghanistan, a country and a history like Afghanistan's, we don't really have the privilege of disarticulating our stories from our politics, local, regional, global, or whatever it may be. We don't have the option of separating it out from colonialism or imperialism. These stories, the Afghan story, is shaped by those really heavy forces. And that's what I wanted to explore in Sparks Like Stars. It's the origins of the conflict, but also the far-reaching consequences of it as well. Next slide, please. I also wanted to really honor the experiences of Afghan Americans. And so this story really came, as many of my stories do, from a newspaper article, which is why I really treasure the work of journalists. And so this is a newspaper article from the New York Times by Carlotta Gall, in which she wrote about the discovery of the bodies of those who had been assassinated or killed in the 1978 military coup. And this article really got me thinking, because it really honed in on the moment that was before the Soviet invasion, but the events and the climate of a Cold War and all those tensions kind of coming to a head in the country and turning things upside down. There were quite a few families who, after that 1978 military coup, made the decision to flee because the climate in the country changed. It became a place of suspicion, and alliances were important, and not really a place where dissent was okay. In this article, I read about 4 grandchildren of then President Daoud Khan, who were also killed that night, the youngest being 18 months old. And that really got me thinking about the presence of children in really tumultuous periods of history, in really pivotal moments, in really hard moments, in bloody moments, and the fact that sometimes, if they survive, they carry that with them for the rest of their lives. And that's why this story is told from the perspective of a young girl, because she has the context and the nuance to tell this story. So it is a collection of anecdotes, and I have to say the research for this was really amazing. It took me down some rabbit holes. And research for books is a really great way to justify going down some internet rabbit holes and just call it work. Next slide, please. So inspired by my friend's father. Next slide, please. One of the things that I wanted to include in this story, because Afghanistan was known as one of the most hospitable countries in the world, was the presence of people who were coming sometimes from the United States or from Europe and venturing into the country, and sort of this, interaction that they were having with local people, and what it must have felt like for the locals and what it must have felt like for those who were coming in and meeting a completely different culture. But how open it was for folks. My father actually, to this day, remembers the name of the Peace Corps volunteer who taught him English. And so some of the connections that have been made have been really powerful. And when I connected with some Peace Corps volunteers recently, they have a network called the Friends of Afghanistan network. My father was so excited and gave me the name and was like, ask them if they can find this person. He would have loved a reunion. The other part, next slide please, of the travelers, the overlanders, one of the things that appears in this book is this travel guide that had been put together for these overlanders, which is a really rich and delicious read. And in it are details about, which checkpoints to watch out for, where to avoid being scammed by a guy who owns camels, where to score the best weed. And then there's one particular passage about where to get the best massage in Turkey in one of the hammams. And this person wrote about it, and I'm going to read this passage to you because it's just too good. She's talking about the masseuse who gives her a massage. Mine, a 357-pound, 32-year-old Turkish woman with sensuous eyes and strong arms, attractively seductive in a whale belly sort of way. And I was 20, an uptight American chick having a tough time peeling off my jeans, left my work boots in their facade at the door. And this woman, her name was Nigris, and she was a real mama. And she's clad only in red lace underpants, stretchy. And I look at her and think to myself, twitching out loud, I'm not ready for this. Next slide, please. It's too good, right? The other part was the presence of American Foreign Service officers in Kabul at the time. And I read through these archives, these interviews. They're like exit interviews, really, of Foreign Service officers who've been stationed in different places around the world. And so I was reading a lot of the interviews with those who were stationed in Kabul during the time, just leading up to the coup, during the coup, and in the aftermath of it. And they're really detailed and really interesting reads. I connected with one of the women, and she kind of expanded on her experiences there and what it was like. And so some of the details about being a woman in the Foreign Service were also very compelling to me, and what kinds of ceilings these women were breaking through, and how they would sometimes downplay their typing skills so that they wouldn't end up stuck in a secretarial position, and how they wanted to defy the rules of being expected to resign if they got married. They also were busy doing things at the Cultural Center at the American Embassy that were surprising, like collaborating with other diplomats and with the Marines to put on a performance of the musical Oklahoma. And if we think about Afghanistan in the past 20 years, it would be hard to imagine that the American diplomats there had time to put on a musical of Oklahoma, and yet that's what was happening. There was also a story about someone's relative who'd been visiting at the time of the coup and happened to be on a rooftop drinking cocktails when she saw these jets flying overhead and kind of wondered, that's interesting. I wonder what's happening. So these are the stories that are very real, and I always feel like when I put together historical fiction books, the strangest parts of the story are the ones that actually happened. Next slide, please. So the political climate of the time, this on the left is a picture of Arg, the presidential palace in Afghanistan. And even in present day, it looks very similar. And so if you happen to see any photographs in the last 2 years of when the Taliban rolled into Kabul, this building was the one that they went into and then all of a sudden took over and sat behind the president's desk, which was really heartbreaking for the country. And on the right, you see a quote from Daoud Khan. So he's the president, the president at the time. He was Afghanistan's first president. And he was really navigating this space where he had two superpowers, kind of vying for attention and cultivating relationships with Afghanistan. And he says here, I feel the happiest when I can light my American cigarettes with Soviet matches. And I think that's a really good way of encapsulating what it felt like and how he was trying to balance that. And I think for a time he thought he was balancing it effectively. Next slide, please. There's also the antiquities. These are some pictures from an old Hellenic civilization that's in Afghanistan. So Afghanistan's really it's been part of the Silk Road. There have been travelers. There's been a lot of interactions with different peoples over time. And one of the losses in conflict has been the ability to continue excavations, to maintain, to safeguard some of the antiquities that have been found. And so that's also something that I wanted to bring up in this story. And some of the pictures that you see here are from a National Geographic exhibit, which was then converted into a really nice coffee table book that shows what the jewelry of that time period looked like. But in conflict, again, this is one of the luxuries of society, is that you lose a lot of the older history. Next slide, please. And then, of course, there are little bits of my own family's history, fried chicken stores being where people landed in the 1980s as an immigrant community, finding their way as entrepreneurs. And then the soundtrack, the music, the experiences of family members who fled the country and then found themselves in the United States and having to rebuild. For people who around me I've seen carrying a lot of trauma, but packing it up, moving on, outwardly looking like they're thriving, and yet you can see that there's a heaviness in them. This last picture is a war carpet, and so Afghanistan, of course, has a lot of carpets. Carpet weaving is important, an important industry, and what happened was over the years, conflict became literally woven into the carpets of Afghanistan. So these war carpets had their own market. I've had a lot of people think that Sparks Like Stars is a memoir, and it's not. I'm thankful that it's not. The stories are not mine, but they are of a collective, and they're a reflection of the experiences of many Afghans who have experienced the conflict, who have experienced that displacement, and experienced the loss. And the reason that I write these stories is because I want to communicate, for one, the level of grief that Afghan people feel. And without knowing that my parents experienced a blissful childhood, that they enjoyed music, that they enjoyed the company of relatives, that they enjoyed being able to have ambitions and aspirations, then you wouldn't understand the level of grief that people feel when all of that is lost. And they've experienced that grief now several times. I had a message from a reader once who emailed me and said, "Nadia, your words move me to my core. I am a member of the Afghan diaspora and left Afghanistan as a 6-year-old in 1981. Your words, stories are like a best friend's whisper, sharing secrets that connect me to my unfinished life. Please keep writing and taking me home." And that means a lot to me. And so what I try to do in these stories is convey the other truths about Afghanistan. That Afghanistan is not only the graveyard of empires, but it is also the graveyard of a lot of Afghans. That Afghan women are, yes, resilient, but they also carry a lot of trauma with them, and that resilience and that persistence comes with a big cost. It takes a toll on them. It takes a toll on how they're able to give to their own families and to themselves. At an event recently with newly arrived young women from Afghanistan, at one point, one of them had to put the microphone down and rushed off stage because she was completely overwhelmed with the emotions. And she, otherwise, would be described as a very strong and resilient Afghan woman. I also wanted to talk, and that's what you see in this book, is a story of a girl and her father, the enduring connection between them. Because another truth about Afghanistan is that we have incredibly supportive and empowering fathers. I'm one of them, but I'm not the only one. So many of my uncles have shown up for celebrations for their daughters, for me. So many of my friends have had fathers cheer them on and champion them to go after any ambitious dream that they have. And that's another lost story of Afghanistan as well. Next slide, please. So 5 months after Sparks Like Stars met the world, we watched another violent upheaval in Afghanistan. The book was called Timely, which is never what I want for an Afghan story because it means that we're repeating another cycle of tragedy. But since the Taliban takeover, what has happened? A lot of Afghanistan has sort of slipped away from the news cycle. And to give you a few updates, the Ministry of Women's Affairs was replaced by the Ministry of Vice and Virtue, which used to exist in the first go-around of the Taliban, 1996 to 2001. Girls are banned from school. They started by banning girls from 6th grade up, and then they banned women from universities, and then they banned girls from elementary school as well. Women can no longer get a driver's license. Women are banned now from public parks and gyms. Women journalists have essentially disappeared from view. The women who served in parliament are completely gone. They no longer have roles, and one of them who went right after the downfall of the country. She tried to leave her house to go to an open session where some of the Taliban were going to be talking, was stopped in the street and asked by a Taliban guard, "Where are you going?" And she said, "Well, I'm in the parliament, I'm going to listen." And he laughed at her and said, "You were. You can go back home now." There have been targeted attacks on minority communities, and protesters, and there still are protesters in Afghanistan, have been detained, interrogated, disappeared, their families threatened. Afghanistan's Human Rights Commission has been shut down in some areas. Our recent Nowruz, which is the first day of spring, and the arrival of the new year had been banned. So I spent a few months working on a mental health program for Operation Allies Welcome, which welcomed the tens of thousands of Afghan refugees who fled the country, including the allies who had served with our military. And listening to those stories of individuals, of families, to women, to children, to some of the Afghan soldiers who had given so much, it often felt like sitting with some of the characters from my novels. And it was quite haunting. But I do remember one young woman sitting with me, and since I talked to her about storytelling, she said, "You know what, I want to write my story." And I think that for her, it felt like the beginning, the first step on a path toward healing. Next slide, please. So I try to end with a little bit of an uplifting note, which is getting harder and harder as the days go by when we're talking about Afghanistan. Next slide, please. But I can tell you that from the people who are here, that we have welcomed now, in that community, there are university students, there are future doctors, some of them are returning to medical school. There are artists, there are mothers, there are families, there are artisans, and there are women soldiers who worked in special forces on missions where they collaborated with Americans. There are musicians who were here from the Zora Women's Orchestra, and this is from a recent event that we held with them. The emotions that they pulled out of a crowd of Afghans was remarkable. There were tears in the room because, again, it's the music that connects us over time, over space. And one of these young women, she expressed, "I cannot live without my music." And it's truly her music that was her salvation, that brought her here, that saved her, and will continue to save her in her toughest days here as she resurrects herself. Next slide, please. And on top of that, it is now spring. The first day of spring, as I said, is Nowruz. It's our new year in this area. I'm sure you've got a lot of Persian New Year festivities going on, so you may see some signs of that. And on the left, you see the table that we had at home to celebrate. There are certain things that we put on the table, a lot of fruits and nuts and symbolic items. And so that is our table. On Monday of this week, I had the privilege of attending the White House's Nowruz reception, which was a really warm gathering and incredible to go into the White House and see a very similar table set up there, to have that kind of a welcome, and to meet so many people who were there to celebrate rebirth, to celebrate optimism and hope. And the president and the first lady did offer some remarks. And they offered some really powerful remarks of solidarity, very importantly, with the women of Iran, and the call for women, life, freedom, the struggle against their oppression and their fight for liberty. What was troubling to me was that the remarks included a passing mention of a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan, when truly the very same struggle is happening right next door. And so there's been a lot of solidarity between the communities of Afghans and Iranians because it's been an incredibly troubling time, a time of moving backwards when it comes to the agency, the liberty, and the respect for the basic human rights of women. And the moment you stop respecting women's human rights, your country starts to fail, your communities start to fail, your families fail. So thank you for welcoming this story into your homes and making space for it, because with this work of fiction, I hope that you can have a more truthful, a more complete view of what the Afghan story is and what the narrative is. It's important to me that books have a place in our communities. And Pasadena, I can tell you, you are an amazing community. If we measure our worlds by the amount of books we read, you guys are really up there. So thank you for the chance to share this with you, and I wish an illuminating and hopeful spring for everyone. Thanks.
The next part of our program is a conversation all together. So I've got some questions to get us started, but if you have any, the staff will be walking around to collect them from you, and we'll add them to the pile and get through as many as we can. After the Q&A, we'll have a book signing. So if you brought a copy of the book, or if you'd like to purchase one in the back of behind us by the entrance, you can pick up a copy, and Nadia will be gracious enough to sign them for us. We do have a hard out at, I think in about 45 minutes from now. We've got to get Nadia on the road to the airport. But let's take advantage of this time while we've got her, okay? So we really want to talk to you about the story in your writing, but before we get there, I think we're all curious about, in light of recent current events in Afghanistan, for you and your family, what is it like to see in the media the struggle and the oppression and the violence that's being reported recently in Afghanistan? What is that like for your family, and how do you deal with it?
So like I said, I think it's thrown people back, and I know a lot of people, not just my family, but friends as well, have felt like they're reliving their trauma. They're reliving the moments where they had to flee, watching these images of people running, literally running. We were in touch with relatives who were at the airport at the time. My cousin was there at the time of the bombing that happened. Wow. And she luckily, with her kids, she was a bit further, so she wasn't right in the center of it. I've met quite a few people who were there and who were injured in part of the bombing who ended up coming here, children included. So, watching them, we were sort of on the edge of our seats every moment because it felt like something was just unfolding. It was like being in the middle of an action movie. And what was different this time, I think, compared to my parents' time, my parents being in the United States because they left earlier, they were hearing the stories of relatives who were leaving the country, some, over the walking over mountains to get out of the country, which is also similar to the way my husband left too. But they didn't have a play-by-play, and that's different.
Oh, yeah.
Because we literally could get text messages and get alerts, and then pass those messages on, and then we could get images right back of like, this is what the airport looks like right now. This is the gate that I'm at. And so we were so much more connected to what was happening at the moment. In a time before, you didn't have that. You had to just sit back and kind of wonder and maybe imagine. Or maybe you couldn't even imagine if you were that removed.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Let's talk about the story, and we love talking about stories and writing. This is a story about a young person that survives violence and war, and I think you have I'll paraphrase it. There's a line in the book that it's easier to kiss your elbow than to talk about the effects of war on children, but you've done that. You've kissed the elbow, and you've really told a very heavy story about what it's like for children. What was that like for you to go to that heavy place about talking about what it's like for a child? What's it like for a child? Yeah.
In the writing of the story, I think I end up doing what my agent says is the right thing to do. She says, the writing will come easiest when the characters are talking to you. And at first I thought that sounded a bit, not so rational and maybe in need of help. But it's true that as a story kind of comes together, and the easier it is, it's because the characters are talking to me. And that's what I tried to do with this particular child, was to imagine, this little girl being there in that moment, and just starting from there and saying, okay, now what happens? And this little character was kind of telling me. telling me what she was doing, how she was reacting. And I've seen children go through some really heavy moments outside of storytelling, just being in a hospital with families who are having their child go through some serious illnesses. We say the same thing about children that we say about Afghan women, is that they're really resilient. Children bounce back, and a lot of people even go into pediatrics because there's a much greater chance that your patient will survive, that they'll recover. But they do that also at a cost, and it takes a toll on them. And that's really what I wanted to explore here, and I thought a child could tell that story best.
Wow. What an interesting connection between your first career as a physician and writing a story. That's fascinating. Tell us about the title. Why Sparks Like Stars?
So, and this is where I always reveal that I am terrible at coming up with titles. And I'm very fortunate that I have a literary agent named Helen Heller, and she is very, very good at coming up with titles. And so in my previous novels, where I've offered up some ideas and they were immediately shot down, we developed a relationship of, okay, I'll write all the pages and you write the few words that come on the cover. And for this book, my previous titles came from lines of Sufi poetry, and I love that, and it really resonates with our culture of poetry and with the things that we have in our home, the books and even the wall coverings. But for this book, I hadn't told Helen that I really want to pick a line of poetry from an Afghan woman. And that's what I wanted to sort of capture the essence of this story. And I was trying really hard to come up with a title and surprise Helen with it. But of course, Helen called me one day and said, I'm here in New York with your editor, and I think I have a title for you, Sparks Like Stars. To which I responded, Helen, I really like it. It just kind of resonated with me. I like the sound of it. But I did tell her, I have no idea what that means. And she told me, well, it's a line that comes from a poem. It's written by an Afghan woman named Nadia Hashimi, who wrote very prolifically up until her life was cut short. She was murdered by her husband. And I thought, this is it. This is the title that I want for this story. Because the verse, and it's included in the book, also kind of talks about the angst that this woman feels in her own life and what she's carrying in her chest. And I thought that really spoke to the experience of this main character as well. Great. So Helen did it again. Thanks.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you, Helen. You said during your presentation that one of your goals in writing this book was to, thank you, Catherine, was to share a side of Afghanistan that we don't commonly see in the media, and you succeeded. Is in hindsight, now that the book is out in our hands, is there anything that you left out that's missing that you're thinking now, I want people to know this too about Afghanistan?
So the one thing that you can't really do in a book, you can talk about it and you can write about it and you can describe it, but what you can't do is offer people a plate of food. And so if there's one thing that I can highly recommend, it's to visit an Afghan restaurant, because the food is really, really good. And I would bring friends home from college and they would just love the food. And it really, I think it's such a remarkable way to connect and to experience what a culture is like, is to sit down, to break bread together if you can, but also just to really savor and enjoy the flavors of foods that have, recipes that have been cultivated over so much time. And then I always really appreciate the links that we have with other nearby cultures and what kinds of foods are similar in different areas, the links between the different types of dumplings that we have and the nearby countries and what they have.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. Okay. I was at a presentation that you gave earlier today, thank you, where one of the audience members praised your journey as a woman writer and the 6 novels, I think, that you've published so far, and was wondering if it's similar as a writer publishing a book to a woman giving birth to something that she's working on.
Yes.
So I'm wondering, is that true? Is writing a book like giving birth? And do you have a favorite kid?
Yes, that was your question.
Yeah.
And you can never answer that question honestly. every book is different, the way every child is different. My mother-in-law often says, my mother-in-law has 5 children. My husband is her eldest. And she always says, my 5 children are like the 5 fingers of my hand. They're all different. And it's true. I mean, my children are different as well. The stories are different because of the impact that they have with readers and things that I hear back from readers. The way, what I mentioned this morning is there's a woman who just wrote to me, and she sent me a picture of her daughter who's now 8 years old, who she named after a character from my first novel because she was so taken by the resilience of this little girl. And to see this little girl now grown up, and she lives in the Marshall Islands. And so that also speaks to just the power of how far books can go. I've never been to the Marshall Islands. I probably won't ever get to go to the Marshall Islands in my lifetime. And yet this story has gone there and has become part of this family. As a labor of love, yes, books are truly a labor of love. And her question, of course, made me think of the first book that I had published and how that came about. So when you write a book, the first thing you have to do if you want to get it published, and I learned this from Googling, is that you have to find a literary agent, someone who will take you on to represent you, who believes in your story, and will then pitch your story to a publishing house to try to find a home for it, where someone will actually put the words onto a page and create a book out of it. And so I had done my homework, and I got about 20 literary agents and prepackaged these query letters and sent out these emails with a little bit of a synopsis of the story and whatever they had specifically asked for. And I did this about 2 weeks before my first child was due. And
thank you, Tom.
Knowing that I wouldn't really be able to get too much done when the child came. So I did all of that, and literally I was in labor in the hospital when my phone rings with a number I don't recognize, and I don't pick it up, and this person leaves a message, and then I listen to it, and I'm like, oh my God, it's a literary agent. She called again, and at that point I gave my phone to my husband, and I said, you need to call this woman right now. And he did, and he explained the situation to her. And Helen said, oh, tell her to go and have the baby and I'll call her next week. and that's exactly what we did. And I was so excited, I was thrilled. And then not too long after that, remember Helen called me and I was literally in the Whole Foods aisle looking at, I think, frozen peas when she called and said, you've got a publishing contract, which I just could not believe. Yeah. So it did feel like, I wrote the book while I was pregnant, when I was expecting. I needed to get it done before this due date, and literally in labor when I get the call that we've got a literary agent.
It's a great story. It's a great story. I've got some questions from the audience. A couple people are interested in your transition from medicine to being a writer. When was the moment that you decided to become a writer?
So I think there was one moment. I do remember there was a time where my husband said, you know what, you love stories so much, because he would see me reading all the time, and he would see how I just kind of collect books that I didn't even have time to read, but I would just collect them. And he said, you know what, you love stories so much, why don't you tell a story? Why don't you write one? He's also a real big believer in legacy. I think legacy is an important part of the Afghan culture too. Is what have you done, what have you created, and what are you leaving here? And that's really, I think, the nudge that got me thinking. Okay, well, what if I was on the other side of the story process, and not just a reader, but what if I did, and what would I write about? And I thought, well, what was natural for me was to write about the things that summoned my attention, the things that had made me feel the biggest feelings, whether it was outrage or sadness, and or gratitude or nostalgia. And that really is what brought me to the set of stories that I've written, is those really big emotions and wanting to channel them into a place where I can capture some of the culture, of the history, and kind of create the stories that I really would have loved to have been able to find when I was a young reader.
Yeah, you succeeded. That's really great. A couple of people have an interesting kind of what-if question that I'll paraphrase. What is your imagination of what Afghanistan would be like today if none of the outside intervention had occurred there? What do you think?
Well, it's hard to answer that question because how far back do you go? Which foreign intervention? Because do we go back to the Soviet? Do we go back to the British? Do we go even further back from then? So it's really hard to say. And I don't know if we'll ever get to know what the natural evolution of a people will be if you exclude outside factors and you exclude outside forces. But I think we're coming close to it. You can see that in Afghanistan, what was happening during the years, there was a chunk of time where there was a monarchy and there was relative peace. And this is a big topic of debate when Afghans get together, is, who really made the mistakes in Afghanistan's history? And at what points and at what turns could something have been done differently to completely change the direction of the country? And I was listening to it recently, and these are the arguments that I've grown up hearing, that the period of the monarchy was incredibly peaceful. There wasn't a war, there wasn't a conflict. And then the counter argument is, well, there really also wasn't enough progress during that time period, and the progress was limited to certain areas. But you could see that even in the period of Daoud Khan, when that presidency came in, there were some motions, there was some direction, some trajectory towards more progress, towards more equality in the country, and the type that didn't just exist in the major cities, but the type that would also start to trickle out into the countrysides, because I think that's where you really create a lasting change, an enduring change, is when everybody is included.
Yeah.
And Afghanistan being a very geographically divisive country, you literally have mountain terrains and you don't really have the infrastructure to support internal communication and connection, it becomes really important to intentionally incorporate and include different outlying areas in whatever's happening.
This question is a good follow-up to that, knowing that the country is, as you said, harder to access different parts of it.
Yeah.
What is the essence of all of Afghanistan? What's the soul of Afghanistan, the person is asking?
It is the one thing of the culture that really kind of carries out no matter where you go is the hospitality. And so, I think even if you walk past my mother-in-law's house, you'll be fed. It's just a thing. You can't go anywhere. And so I did several sessions of cultural orientation and training with resettlement agencies, with hospitals, with different people who were working with some of the Afghan refugees who are arriving. And one of the questions that came up was like, every time I talk to this Afghan family, they keep inviting me to come in and stay and eat with them. Should I do that? And so you'd have to tell them, well, this is really, it's something, it's not just a gesture. People really are trained that you can't just say, oh, hi to someone. You're like, oh my gosh, it's great to see you. You have to come over, please, at least for a cup of tea, right? And that's something that I think no matter what of the small ethnicities in Afghanistan you meet, that's it. Wow. And that was the culture that people were drawn to in the 70s when they were coming into the country, that they would say that it's the most hospitable place on the country. And that, again, is the level of loss that we've experienced, because in the past couple of decades, people would not necessarily have the same sentiment or assumption about Afghanistan. Although a lot of people who did travel there as journalists or as foreign service officers or in different fields, even in this time of kind of chaos and rebuilding, they did walk away with that feeling too, once they got in there and started to meet people.
So hospitality is a very big part of everyday life then, and you talked about music too as being something that really resonated with people. Is poetry a big part of everyday life in Afghanistan?
It is. So my family, my relatives would talk about when they were in school that they would engage in what was called sher jangi. And sher means poetry and jangi means fighting. And so Afghans used to fight with poetry, where one would recite a verse of a poem, and then somebody else would combat it with something else, and they'd go back and forth to see who could recite the most. And that is something that I mean, you can say that like in Afghan, you'll find illiterate Afghans on the street, but even the illiterate Afghans will be able to recite some poetry for you. So it's a really, really important part of the culture that, you know, the poetry's been taken, the lines of Rumi have been taken and converted into lyrics of a song and verses of a song. So it's really infused. It's like in our water, basically.
That's awesome. Awesome. I think a lot of us were really moved and learned a lot about displacement and the story of Afghan refugees. If we want to learn more, or if we want to support families or individuals, what would your suggestion be to us?
So I love local organizations because I think that it's a really great way to see very directly what the impact is. In my area, we've had organizations where people have gone on Zooms together. My dad did a lesson where he taught people how to make a soup. And then people at home were cooking the soup, and they packaged it up, and it got delivered to refugee families. So that was a cool way to, you know, engage and connect with people. I think the local organizations also, like resettlement agencies, may be able to connect. Interfaith groups have been really amazing. Afghan Refugee Relief, which is not too far from here, has been doing really great stuff in setting up apartments, setting up homes. What really helps is actually teaching people how to drive. You can imagine, as a woman coming to this country, how empowering it can be to learn the language, to have somebody to have some practice conversations with, or to learn how to drive. Because if I couldn't drive, I would be stuck. And for a lot of people, it is what gives them the ability to navigate this world and to take care of their families in a very different way.
We're fortunate to have that program with Sahar, the organization that assists with educating Afghan women and girls. Can you tell us a little bit about that organization, and does that give you hope for what they're doing? Yeah.
It does. So Sahar is one of the organizations I'm on the board of, and it has been creating, building, and funding boarding schools and private schools for girls in Afghanistan. And it's been really important work that had to get retooled and reorganized in the aftermath of the Taliban takeover, because all of a sudden they didn't really have the ability to create these schools and to bring girls in. And I have to say that with the edicts of the Taliban, they're not uniformly enforced across the country. And so some communities have been able to navigate a little bit more leniency and others have not. But Sahar has had to try to figure out, okay, well, if we can't bring the girls into the schools, what can we do? And so like Sahar, several other organizations have done the same thing, where it's like, okay, well, what if we give them tablets? And what if we can roll out some online programs in the same way that we were all figuring out, well, what can we do during the pandemic? Of how can we continue to connect, and how can we not lose ground while we're so very limited in the in-person or in the direct access. And so that's what Sahar's been doing, is partnering with on-the-ground local individuals, organizations, to create alternatives. And that's what a lot of the international community has been doing. The challenge with doing that is that if you start to do all these workarounds, you start to kind of almost forgive the fact that you don't have the institutions that every community should have, that you don't have these daughters going into government-supported public schools that uniformly create access for everyone there. But it's, you know, people are stuck with really tough choices, with really tough decisions.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to circle back to the book again. We've got a question about the plot. Why did the soldier Shahir help Sitara? What do you think?
So that's a good question, and we won't spoil anything for those in the book. It's very, very early on that in the military coup, there's this young girl that's mentioned, and then this soldier comes and saves her, decides to help her escape. And, you know, I think that, like I was talking about earlier, where there's a lot of back and forth in Afghan households about what was wrong and who was right, I do believe that people who are involved with these types of movements in the country they do so, some of it is about, ego and wanting to be in the leadership of a new institution, but on the smaller level, you get a lot of people who were, as we say, following orders and believed that what they were doing was right because they justified it by the importance that it had for their own family, for the safety, the security that it provided their own family. And so, here you are saving some people, but sacrificing some others. And that for me is a really interesting area, that really interesting gray to be in. Is he a good person because he saved one girl, but was part of a military coup? Is that enough? Like, what do you have to do to be redeemed?
Yeah, thanks. The next comment card is not a question, but it's a response that I think you'll enjoy hearing from one of the audience members who enjoyed your book. And if you have a response to it, of course, you're welcome to respond to it. But this is the message from one of the people in the audience. I was able to identify with several of your slides, as I was one of the American travelers who traveled from Istanbul to Agra and spent some time in Herat and Kabul in the early 1970s. Sharing cultural experiences and other things with Afghans and others was an experience that was truly memorable, and I'm so sorry that those experiences are no longer available. The person wrote.
I love that. I have to say that in just about every library event, every festival that I go to, there is inevitably somebody, and at this point I joke with my husband, I'm like, I'm waiting for that person.
Yeah.
There's somebody in the room who spent time, lived in Afghanistan, traveled through Afghanistan, worked in Afghanistan during the 60s or 70s, and they always had a positive experience, which is really, really nice to hear about because it existed. And if something exists once, there is the possibility, as remote as it may seem, that it can exist again.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. So I tried to combine some of those questions. If there are any more, I'll just ask the staff one last time to collect any that might be there, and then just have a couple more and wrap things up. So have you traveled to Afghanistan?
So I made my first trip to Afghanistan in 2003, and it was for my parents the first time that they'd gone back since they left in the early 70s. And so it was sort of a dual trip. I was seeing the country for the first time, having grown up with the sort of what I call the spiritual connection to the country without having the physical or the geographic connection to it. So I met family members who I hadn't seen. I visited schools and saw really eager little children lined up ready for their classes. I visited hospitals and spoke with some folks in the public health service. So it was a really eye-opening experience, but I also witnessed my parents going home after so long. My dad's childhood home was there. Two of his brothers were still living there. They'd shared the house, 2 levels of it, with their families. And my mom's childhood home, we went to her street to try to find it. And all she could find was this corner of a stairwell, one banister, was all that remained. Wow. Everything else had been completely reduced to rubble. And so I do remember my mom standing on that street and kind of looking up and down and thinking, it's supposed to be here. And it wasn't there. And then she recognized that one piece of the stair, and I think it just kind of hit her that there's really nothing. There's really nothing left. And by that point, most of our family was gone. There was another childhood home elsewhere that she had lived in that some cousins and relatives had taken on, and they were living in there. And I remember going into that home, and they'd taken us into one room, and they had this trunk there. And they said, you should open the trunk. And we opened the trunk, and inside the trunk was like my second grade school photo with like the blue laser background. And so these were the pieces that my parents had sent home, those little blue airmail envelopes. That was the correspondence that we had, was popping a letter in the mail and then waiting and waiting and waiting for a letter to come back. And so here were these little tidbits that my parents had sent, these little updates from their lives that they were sending home to their parents, to their family members, because they really couldn't see each other for decades.
Wow, amazing. We loved discovering your writing through Sparks Like Stars, and some of us are now catching up on reading your previous books. It that hadn't done that before. But for those of us that are ready for the next book by Nadia Hashimi, what should we expect? What are you working on next?
So I'm just about to turn in the last revisions on my first young adult book, and I'm hoping that will be out next year. And so that'll be an exploration of a younger Afghan-American experience and an event that hits a family hard against the backdrop of a community dealing with an influx of refugees and displaced peoples as well.
Oh. Yeah. We can't wait to read it. Good luck. Thanks.
Well, that's
Thank
good
you.
pressure on me to get it done.
Okay. Thanks. Good. Well, I think we're going to transition now. If you have a book that you'd like Nadia to sign, we'll set up a table for her. And like I said, we will have to be strict about the time because we need to get you on the road. But thank you, Nadia, so much.
Thank you all so much.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Yeah.